I want to congratulate, first of all, the organizers of this very crucial and seminar at a very critical time, where South Asia as a region, I think, is being beset by all kinds of bigotry. And in this situation of crisis that we are discussing, uh, the dynamics of South Asia. And one of the most important aspect of a dialogue or a kind of space where we can exchange or a platform for exchange would be translation. And as my area is translation, my focus is not going to be so much upon how to translate or my own experiences as translators, but looking at the growing body of translated texts from South Asia and entering academia, of course. We need to look at what are the ways in which we can read and understand these texts, especially when the first languages are not the languages that we understand. For example, if we are to read Lihaf in Kerala, for example, or if we are to read Bashir in Pakistan, through English. So English becomes a space where we exchange and share. But in order to read and understand these translated texts, I think we need to take a closer look at this growing archive of Indian and South Asian literature in English translation. So my focus is going to be more upon reading, analyzing, and looking at the contexts of translations into English. That's the focus of my presentation. And I just want to uh, uh, just allude to what Saida Hamid ma'am says about Urdu being a Muslim language. And when we think of English, we don't ever call it a Christian language, which is very funny. Means how languages and religious identities are conflated for political purposes becomes a problem, because we use one standard for one language and we don't use the same standard for other. And English is the language that I think in South Asia, one of the most sought after languages is English. So I'm going to talk about English and the whole asymmetric context of English translation and reception is going to be my focus. So if I'm allowed to share my screen for PPT, can I do that? I don't know if I'm visible. Okay, just share my screen. Is my screen visible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So the topic is world Englishes, and I would like to draw your attention to the plural use here: world literature and globalization, asymmetric context of translation in South Asia. And we are looking at a contemporary temporal phase after 80s and late 80s and 90s, where there is an expansive growth in processes of globalization. But along with this process, we also see the rise of new conceptualizations to think about literatures and languages. And one of such conceptualizations is the idea of world Englishes in plural. Along with that, the idea of world literature is also something that has been debated, discussed, and rethought in several ways in the era of globalization, especially after the fall of Berlin Wall. And it is in the same period that translation studies has seen an expansive growth. So what are the convergences between these three ideas of translation, world Englishes, and world literature is something that I'm going to think about. And I've just started thinking about this topic, so I'm just scratching the surface. But I'm sure it might, your inputs from distinguished audience and scholars and translators will be of great help for me to develop these ideas further. And what and how I plan to go about it is by I am going to critically engage with Vinay Dharwarkar's theory and practice of translation into English, being a very important theorist and a translator that he is. and try to map several asymmetric contexts of translation ecology in South Asian context in order to explore convergences and disjunctures in conceptualization of world Englishes, world literature, and translation. What I will do, as I'm aware that we are in Kolhapur, and one of the most renowned poets from Kolhapur would be Arun Kolhatkar. And so I will just begin by reading out a small poem by Arun Kolhatkar in Marathi and look at the two translations to start with, done by two different people, which will provide a kind of ground or the archive which we are trying to understand through certain theoretical conceptualization. And the poem is very well known, so I'm sure some of you may be already aware of it, but even then, this is a very famous poem called Takta, which belongs to the abecedarian genre, where alphabet is used as lines of the poems. So, Takta, Ananas, Ai, Izar, Idlimbu, Ukhar, ऊस आणि एडका सगळे आपापले चौकोन सांभाळून बसलेत. एरण, ओंडवा, औषध आणि आंबा, कप, खटाळा, गणपती आणि घर सगळ्यांच्या स्वतःच्या मालकीच्या जागा आहेत. चमचा, छत्री, जहाज आणि जबलं, टरबूज, ठसा, डबा, ढग आणि बाण सगळे आपापले जागे ठाण मांडून बसलेत. तलवार, थडग, दौत, धनुष आणि नळ, पतंग, फणस, बदक, भटजी आणि मका यांचा एकमेकांना उपद्रव होण्याची शक्यता नाही. यज्ञ, रथ, लसूण, वजन आणि शहामृग, षटकोण, ससा, हरिण, कमळ आणि क्षत्रिय या सगळ्यांनाच अढळपद मिळालंय. बाई बाळाला उखळात घालणार नाही, भटजी बदकाला लसणाची फोडणी देणार नाही, टरबुजाला थळकून जहाज दुभंगणार नाही. शहामृग जोपर्यंत जबलं खात नाही तोपर्यंत क्षत्रिय पण गणपतीच्या पोटात बाण मारणार नाही. आणि हेडक्यानं ओंडव्याला टक्कर दिली नाही तर ओंडव्याला थडग्यावर कप फोडायची काय गरज आहे. So this is the poem, and it uses this Marathi alphabet chart. And let's look at two English translations for those who don't understand it, because our discussion is going to be around these poems. So pictures, and this is the first translation. Pictures from a Marathi alphabet chart. Pineapple, mother, pants, lemon, mortar, sugarcane, ram. How secure they look, each ensconced in its own separate square. Mango, anvil, cup, Ganpati, cart, house, medicine bottle, man touching his toes. All very comfortable. They all know exactly where they belong. Spoon, umbrella, ship, frock, watermelon, rubber stamp, box, cloud, arrow. Each one of them seems to have found its special niche, a sinecure. Sword, inkwell, tombstone, longbow, water tap, kite, jackfruit, Brahmin, duck, maize. Their job is to go on being themselves, and their appointment is for life. Yagna, chariot, garlic, ostrich, hexagon, rabbit, deer, lotus, archer. No, you don't have to worry. There is going to be no trouble in this peaceable kingdom. The mother will not pound the baby with a pestle. The Brahmin will not fry the duck in garlic. That ship will not crash against the watermelon. If the ostrich won't eat the child's frog. The archer won't shoot an arrow in Ganpati's stomach. And as long as the ram persists, the impulse of butting him from behind, what possible reason could man touching his toes have to smash the cup on the tombstone? So this is the first translation. And I'm deliberately not telling you the names of the translators. The second translation of the same poem is titled Alphabet. So you can see the difference even in the titles. Anvil, arrow, bow, box, and Brahmin, cart, chariot, cloud, and compost heap are all sitting in their separate squares. Corn, cup, deer, duck, and frog, Ganesh, garlic, hexagon, and house all have places of their own. inkpot, jackfruit, kite, lemon, and lotus, mango, medicine, mother, old man, and ostrich are all holding their proper positions. Pajamas, pineapple, rabbit, and ram, sacrifice, seal, spoon, and sugarcane won't interfere with each other. Sword, tap, tombstone, and umbrella. Warrior, watermelon, weight, and yacht have all found their eternal resting place. The mother won't put their baby on the compost heap. The Brahmin won't season the duck with garlic. The yacht won't hit the watermelon and sink. Unless the ostrich eats the baby's frog, the warrior won't shoot an arrow into Ganesha's belly. And if the ram doesn't knock down the old man, why would he need to smash the cup on the tombstone? I leave that to you to figure out which is a better translation of this, because anyway, even if we think of which is better translation and why, you can see the difference between the two translations. The Marathi poem is using Marathi alphabet chart. The first translation retains this Marathi Marathi alphabet chart schema, right? While the second translation uses the English alphabet chart schema, anvil, arrow, bow, box, and Brahmin. So there is a kind of recasting of Marathi alphabet chart into English in the second translation. The first translation retains this Marathi schema. Now, the question would be, which translation would be more acceptable in which space and why? And these are the questions that we are going to think about. The second translation, incidentally, is by a well-known scholar named Vinay Dharwadkar. The first translation is by the poet himself. One of the ways of thinking about South Asian literatures in English translation is through the idea of what is known as world literature. And the notion of world literature has been around from 19th century, as long as probably the discipline of comparative studies was formulated. But it was the thinking about the whole notion of world literature was reinvigorated with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The traditional meaning of world literature was more of qualitative one or quantitative one, by which I mean that it's kind of masterpieces of world literature. We mentioned Chekhov and we mentioned so many other canonical writers. So one understanding of the term world literature is canonical one. The other one was largely quantitative one, as a kind of sum total of all literatures in the world. However, both these ways of understanding world literature were critiqued, and different models were brought out in the 90s and the beginning of 20th century, especially because of people like Pascal Casanova, Franco Moretti, and David Damrosch. They both tried to dislodge this conventional, traditional understanding of world literature. And for David Damrosch, all literary texts that circulate outside their origin, culture of origin, become world literature. So Kabir would be world literature, and Tagore would be world literature. And you can see that there is a space for anti-canonical formulations possible when we look at those texts which circulate outside the culture of origin. So Kolhapur's both poems in English versions are part of world literature because they occupy spaces which are no longer in the context of Marathi. So instead of looking at world literature as an infinite, ungraspable canon, Damrosch insists on looking at the modes of circulation. Yeah, so you can see that translation becomes a mode of circulation, something which makes world literature possible in first place. It's a condition for world literature. Another very important formulation of world literature is by Franco Moretti, who says that literature today is a planetary system. And when we say planetary system, Lihaf can be as much studied in Bangladesh as in Sri Lanka, as in Pakistan, as in India, and so on. So when a translated text occupies transnational space, especially when it's English. And what Marathi goes on to argue is that we have to understand this space as using the World System School of Economic History by Wallerstein. And he insists on looking at it as a unitary and unequal space. Now, this unequal is extremely important because there is a distinction between core and periphery of this global system of literature, what Pascal Casanova calls World Republic of Letters, is unequal. Its centers are still very much Europe and America, and its peripheries would be our South Asian spaces, social and cultural spaces. And as Professor Devi was pointing out yesterday, almost 25% of population is in this a space called South Asia. And yet we are at the peripheries of a world literary system. So in this light, the South Asian literatures in translation can be viewed as occupying peripheral space of world literature. So both poems in English circulate outside the culture of origin. So this is one way of thinking about South Asian literature in English translation. I'm going to look at some other ideas which one of the translators of Kolhapur poem, the second one, and try to understand his theory of translation as well in a nutshell. And he lays down the first, he talks about 10 principles of translation. And he says that translating in the millennium, Indian literature in the world market, in the global market. So we are looking at global markets here, and his first principle is that we should rigorously conform to international standards of translation and publication. In a global economy, Dharwalkar says, we cannot predict where a book will find its reader at home or abroad. The audience of Indian and by extension South Asian literary works in translation is now scattered worldwide and includes Indian, South Asian diasporic Indians, and there are a substantial number of South Asians in the world, and non-Indians of every variety interested in India. Our representations of Indian literature will succeed in global marketplace only if they conform to these international standards of production and form. So what he is actually saying is a widely held commonsensical assumption about politics of Indian and South Asian literatures in English translation. And he goes on to add, we ought to render our text consistently into international standard English and not Indian English. And this is where I think the problem starts cropping up with the first principle that Dharwalkar lays out. Because if you look at the first translation of the Kolhapur poem, done by the poet himself, where he's trying to, as if, Marathify English language, because the poem itself is about language as a way of looking at the world, as if each language has its own worldview, which is encapsulated by this alphabet chart that he's talking about. So language and the world have their own ways of modeling and mapping. So each language models and maps the world in its own way. So the Kolhapur's own strategy of translation, it seems, is to Marathi-size English by making English conform to Marathi alphabet chart. While Dharwalkar's own practice seems to be transforming Marathi worldview to suit or fit into the Anglophone worldview by transforming the Marathi alphabet chart into English alphabet. So even if you look at the titles of the poems, they themselves mark the difference between the strategies of translations that we have just seen. And he goes on to talk about world literature like Aeschylus and Dante and Flaubert and Dostoevsky and so on, Neruda and Marquez, Pamo. And he says that many of our classics do not conform to these global standards of English. And that's why there is some sort of failure of South Asian literatures in English translation to find place in the global literary system, global world literature. So, and then just as an extension of what I'm saying about Darwadkar, he goes on in his 8th principle is very interesting, where he says that translator's job is to carry a translate text and its readers simultaneously. And he is drawing upon A.K. Ramanujan's famous statement that one translates not just the text but also the reader. So he says that literary translation should carry over a text from one language to another, which he is not doing. What he is doing, he is trying to transform Marathi worldview and make it conform to the Anglophone worldview in order to maybe pitch South Asian literatures at a global marketplace. But his own 8th principle says exactly the opposite. He is saying that the reader who may be in the central or the core regions of Anglophone world, like native speakers, which I'm going to just talk about briefly as we proceed. And then you have to bring South Asian text to the reader, while his 8th principle says it's the other way around. So there is some tension between his own principles, which are almost paradoxical as we go along when we start looking at his own formulations of these principles. And then his 5th principle is also very interesting. He is that translation should convey the original's diction, style, voice, and tone as precisely as possible. Now, is it possible to have diction, style, voice, and tone independent of language? Means when we talk of Ismet Chugtai, her own view, her diction, her style, her voice is deeply embedded in the language that she is using. So when you want to bring out that in translation, then you have to go away from what he has said as the international standards of English, of international English. Plus, I also feel skeptical whether there are any spelled out canonical fixed international standards of international English, which even the native speakers themselves use. Because the language being a very fluid and dynamic entity, the native speakers would as much flaunt the norms of standard English as the, say for example, the users of standard Marathi. Nobody speaks standard Marathi in Maharashtra, right? In same way, I don't think there are any standard language speakers at all. Does that even exist, except on BBC, or maybe even not in BBC any longer, with multicultural news readers being part of BBC. So whole idea of international standards to which your translation should rigorously conform becomes a problem, because they are not spelled out. And secondly, they are not even fixed. At the same time, so many post-colonial writers, by which we mean Anglophone writers, which is in my view, a very problematic idea, because Ismet Chugtai is as much post-colonial as Rushdie, but we don't think on those lines. Have this liberty of chutnification of English, as Rushdie would use mongrel hybrid English. And I have a feeling that it's used more for exoticization for the Anglophone market. So are there any other ways of thinking about this whole question of English? Is the last point that I'm trying to make here. And this is based on the notion of world Englishes as developed by Braj Kachru. So South Asian literatures in English, translations especially, are to be understood as belonging to world Englishes. And what do we mean by world Englishes? Then Braj Kachru says that there is no such thing like single English, which is in contrast to what Dharwadkar is saying. Because English has become a global language, but at the same time, functionally and in terms of form as well, it has diversified. It has become polycentric, pluricentric. And he tries to critique this notion of globalization of English as a success story of singular monocultural Western language by highlighting in terms of functional pragmatism, especially that of multiple canonicity in Englishes, British, North American, African, and Asian languages. In other words, Kachru states that what we need is a conceptualization of World English in a framework of pluricentricity and a distinctive cultural formation. So while Dharwadkar seems to be saying that we should conform to the norms of Anglophone native speaker variety of English, Kachru is talking about distinctiveness of various kinds of Englishes used in the peripheries as well as in South Asia. And he says that the term international used with English is misleading in more than one sense. It signals an international English in terms of acceptance, proficiency, functions, norms, pragmatic utility, and creativity. This is actually far from true. This is not the current international functional profile of English language and never was. We just have to turn on our English news channels to hear the fact that it is not the Anglophone variety of English that you hear. It's Indian and South Asian varieties that you hear on the news channels. So he provides an alternative conceptualizations in this very famous diagram called the three circles of English, where the first circle, according to Kachru, consists of mostly the so-called native speakers of English. He uses the term first diaspora, which is very accurate. Means English as it spread to USA, Canada, Australia, where it's mostly the first language. That's the inner circle. The outer circle would consist of South Asian varieties of English, as well as the ex-colonies, where English has become second and very important language. And that includes places like Hong Kong, Bangladesh, Ghana, India, Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Zambia. So Africa and South Asia, these peripheral spaces of world literary system, belong to the outer circle, the second circle of world Englishes, according to Kachru. And the third is the expanding circle. Means English is now spreading into those regions where it was not first language, nor were these places colonized, like China, Egypt, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Russia, Zimbabwe. So you can see that English is a growing phenomena, but it is pluricentric. However, the norms of canonicity, or what constitutes as good English or standard English, come from the inner circle and in some ways still are hegemonic in the outer circle. In theory, however, in practice, like I am using an English which is not the first circle variety of English. So Braj Kachru is trying to draw attention at multicentrality of English, the multiplicity of Englishes in the world today, rather than saying that it's the one language that exists even in China and Pakistan. These are two different languages. Chinese English would be different from Pakistani English, would be different from Indian varieties of English, and so on and so forth. And this polycentricity and polycanonicity is something that we should start acknowledging as translators as well. If we can accept Indian English or South Asian English or for our news channels and newspapers, there is no reason why we should not be accepting this as a canon for translation. as a standard. So instead of following Dharwadkar's first principle, I think we should now try to reformulate, rethink what are our norms and standards for translation. And the last point I will just talk about in a nutshell and stop is how do we then go about mapping this asymmetrical translational ecology in South Asia. And I'm going to use Professor Devi's term bhasha. Vernacular is also acceptable to me. Translation from English to bhasha or English to vernacular occupies more privileged space compared to translation between bhashas. So translation from Urdu to Hindi, Hindi to Urdu, or Bangla to Odia, or Odia to Gujarati occupy asymmetrically lower space compared to translation from English to Bhasha, which means that it is more privileged and hegemonic model of translation in South Asia. Within English Bhasha translation, there is still yet more asymmetry. Translation from English into Bhasha occupies far more privileged space, hegemonic space compared to Bhasha to English. So there is a greater traffic of text from English to South Asian languages rather than from other way around happening. So there is fewer number of Indian or Urdu literary texts or Gujarati literary texts going into English compared to English text coming into Gujarati or Urdu. Within that, there is yet more asymmetry where native Anglophone translators who are based, whose first language is English, occupy the South Asian studies centers in the Europe or America, have greater privilege and visibility compared to non-native translators. Maybe, and this is the problem that we should think about, which is not to undermine. I'm not going to rant against it as neo-Orientalism because I don't believe that's so. But native Anglophone translators have done to Marquez or Pamuk. So what? So while in South Asia, it's South Asians who are translating South Asians most of the time, and that is an asymmetry or an inequality. Translation between bhashas have still more inequality built into it. Means translation from Bangla and Hindi have greater space and visibility compared to, say, for example, Gujarati, Marathi, and Punjabi, for example. So there are minor South Asian languages as well as major South Asian languages, which is a kind of inequality. And finally, the generic inequality in the sense that popular literature gets translated into regional languages more than the literary text. So these are some of the asymmetries and which are reflected in the flows of translation in this world literary space of globalization. And with this, I want to actually end my presentation, opening up these questions, and your inputs, critical suggestions would help me to formulate my argument further as we move along. So I want to end by again thanking the organizer and Professor Pansare in particular for having me here in this very important seminar. Thank you.